God calls us to be good people. Why? Because it's nice to be nice to the nice? Isn't just saying, I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior enough? That way I can continue to live my life as I want to, right? If I can rationalize away any behavior of mine, how can I really ever know if I'm doing well? There are answers to all of these questions. And if you're not familiar with Catholic virtue ethics, then the next 2 episodes of this podcast are going to be so eye-opening. Here we go. Welcome to All Roads Lead to Rome. I'm Dr. Bickford, and this is episode 18. This episode focuses on Catholic virtue ethics. And episode 19 will go through the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. And the only truly ethical thing you can do right at this moment is to like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast. And leave a glowing review to show that I am not just talking to myself in each of these episodes. After all, I already talk to myself in so many other areas of life. I don't need to do that here as well. And please be sure to tell your Catholic curious friends whether they think they need this podcast or not. Thank you. In this podcast, there has been a fair amount of talk about theology. Theology addresses the questions of faith about God, human nature, the purpose of life, and about the life and work of Jesus. We study these things so we can have a clear understanding of who God is and what we are called to be as Christians. Today, we shift our focus just a bit and look at a subject within theology called ethics. Once we have a good understanding of what it means to be Catholic, we need to know how we are to live our daily lives based on our faith. The answer to this question is driven by our understanding of what our goal in life is. If you want to get technical, understanding our ultimate goal in life is called teleology. And teleology is a subject within theology. Yeah, I know. So, for Catholics, what is our primary purpose here on earth? It's to be holy, right? So, Catholic ethics is meant to help us to become truly holy. How do we do that? By having a thorough list of do's and don'ts in life? That is true of ethics in many other religious groupings. Ethics in the secular world basically says, you can do anything you want, so long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else doing whatever they want to. And then, depending on your political views, you add a few other hot button issues on one side or the other. Catholic ethics is known specifically as virtue ethics, and it integrates classical philosophy and theology into something now referred to as classical theism. That's an important term in this podcast, and we will reference it quite a bit in the future. So let's cover a little philosophy and then see how the master himself, St. Thomas Aquinas, brings it all together. If you don't care about the historical development of this, then just bear with the rest of us for a bit and then we'll get to the good stuff momentarily. One of the true classics of Western literature is Plato's Republic. It was written around the year 375 BC. That's 375 years before the birth of Jesus. It wrestles with the question of whether or not we can build a just society. And this is the book where we get the parable of Plato's cave, an earth-shaking story for most people the first time they hear it. In Book 4 of the Republic, Socrates argues that the city is only happy when most of the people are happy. They can't have too much, they can't have too little. If it's organized well, it will be good. And to be good is to have 4 things. First, to be wise, which means prudent decision-making. Second, to be courageous, which means to be able to do the hard things and confront fear. Third, to be temperate, which means reason has control over the will. And then fourth and finally, to be just, which means doing what you can and being satisfied with it. And, he argued, if we have justice, then we can perfect the other 3 virtues. This understanding was revolutionary at the time and is why Plato's Republic is still so important in Western civilization today. Well, a generation later, Aristotle built on this, especially in a book of his called Nicomachean Ethics, Nicomachean, Nicomachean Ethics. This book was written around 350 to 330 BC, give or take a week. It's another true classic of Western literature. He saw that life itself has a goal and that it is working toward it, and the goal is of having a flourishing life. To live a life as fully human as possible. And to achieve a flourishing life was done by cultivating virtue, by using reason and will. Aristotle saw temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice as being what he called cardinal virtues. The use of the word cardinal may seem odd, but it actually means hinge, like a hinge on a door. So these four cardinal virtues are the hinge on which all other virtues swing. And the other virtues were things that were means between two extremes, where you had excess on one end and deficiency on the other, and the virtue was actually in the middle. Stay with me for a bit on this. It's really interesting. So when we act certain ways, each action, one way or another, is related to a virtue. If we don't show enough of the virtue, then there's a deficiency of it. If we go too far the other way, then we have an excess. The trap is that we may see the connection of our action to the virtue, but don't realize we aren't truly manifesting the virtue, just part of it. Okay, so far so good. Keep tracking with me on this. So here's an example. The virtue of courage is knowing what needs to be done and willing to do it no matter how hard. It exists between the deficiency of cowardice, which knows what must be done but won't do it, and the excess of rashness, which doesn't know what must be done, but it's willing to try to do it anyway. All right, do you see how that works? A rash person may think they are courageous, but they're only manifesting part of the virtue and are not really truly virtuous in their behavior. How about another example? Modesty. Modesty is a virtue. It's having a good sense of what is appropriate and what is not. If you have a deficiency of modesty, then you are shameless and you have no understanding of appropriateness. If you have an excess, you will exhibit too much shyness and keep people at too much of a distance. People who are both shameless or overly shy may argue that they are appropriately modest by some measure that they pick, but they don't really manifest the virtue. I'll give you one last example. Truthfulness. Truthfulness is the virtue that exists between the deficiency of self-deprecation, where we do not view ourselves as being very good, or as good as we are, and the excess of boastfulness, where we have too high a view of ourselves. So truthfulness is somewhere in between. All right, do you see how this works? So for Aristotle, true virtue is exhibiting a mean between two extremes. And in Nicomachean Ethics, he walks through a whole range of emotions and behaviors and shows how that for each virtue, there is a deficiency and an excess and how they're connected. What makes it fascinating is that we're looking at virtues as part of a continuum or a range, not as a discrete individual thing. And you can easily find charts of them online, and you can see how each virtue is a golden mean for each continuum. It brings so much of the ethical life into focus. It's an incredible piece of work. Now, these ideas were further developed and integrated into Christian theology by St. Augustine around the year AD 400, so quite a bit of time had passed. He took the idea of virtue and focused on the role of divine grace and what that plays in our efforts to focus the orientation of our lives on God. You see, Aristotle tried to find a way to build a meaningful life on our own. Augustine knew that we can only go so far on our own. God's grace is absolutely essential. So Augustine focused less on the cardinal virtues and more on what God pours into our lives as followers of Christ. In the 1200s AD, St. Thomas Aquinas took both the Aristotelian understanding and the Augustinian understanding and built an entire theological framework where he talked about Aristotle's ideas of nature, of natural virtues that we can cultivate, and Augustine's ideas of theological virtues that are infused in us by God. So for Aquinas, the goal wasn't a flourishing human life like it was for Aristotle. For Aquinas, the goal is beatitude. What is that? Beatitude is total happiness and communion with God, which is a trait we see in all the saints. Aquinas says in Article 8 of Question 3 of the first part of the second part of the Summa, quote, "Man's happiness consists in the vision of the divine essence," end quote. That's the only way we experience true happiness, the vision of the divine essence. In this masterpiece he wrote, the Summa Theologiae, 60% of that 5,000-page book deals with ethics, mostly through the vast second section of the work. Others have contributed to the idea of virtue ethics over the years, but Aquinas is still the primary way Catholics see the moral life and how we grow towards holiness. So, let's work on this today through Aquinas' approach. If you didn't want the history part, this is where you jump back in and join the rest of us. We missed you. The Summa Theologiae is split up into 4 parts, but they are named in a confusing way that we all have to put up with. There is the first part, dealing with God and human nature, and then there is the first part of the second part, and then the second part of the second part, and then finally the third part, which focuses on Christ and the sacraments. Confusing, right? Well, he did this because the 2 parts of the second part deal with ethics. The first part of the second part deals with them in a general way, and the second part of the second part deals with the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues in a much deeper manner. And that's the part we'll deal with in the next episode. So today, if you're keeping score, we focus on the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. What a mouthful. The underlying assumption in this part is that all human actions must be evaluated in light of their orientation toward God. Our moral actions are ones that come from the use of reason as well as free will. Actions that are instinctive or involuntary, those behaviors don't count as moral actions. These moral actions are things we have to think through and act on, for good or for bad. Now, Aquinas goes pretty deeply into how our intention and circumstances can affect a moral act. He goes into things like the principle of double effect, which we don't need to cover here. He explores different kinds of law, which doesn't need to be covered here. But Aquinas also accepts that emotions play a role in our moral actions. Some traditions reject emotions. They don't want to deal with them at all. But Aquinas sees them as being very much a part of the human condition. He also believes that emotions can be ordered towards the good. A great example comes from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, quote, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven," end quote. So through faith, we can shape our emotions to the point where we can even learn to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. That's a very high bar. But Jesus is saying it's one that can be achieved. It's a very high bar. Aquinas then devotes significant attention to the nature of habits, which he calls stable dispositions that shape behavior. Virtues are good habits that enable a person to act well consistently. he uses the 4 cardinal virtues that Aristotle worked on. These virtues for Aquinas are, again, prudence, right reason and action; justice, giving each their due; fortitude, courage in adversity; and then finally temperance, moderation of desires. We can work through these and get better at them through the cultivation of a virtuous life. But these are the virtues we can cultivate. There are also, for Aquinas, 3 theological virtues that are infused in us by God. We can do nothing to cultivate them. It is through our deep relationship with Christ that God pours these in greater and greater amounts into our lives. The theological virtues are faith, belief in God; hope, trust in God's promise; and charity, love of God and neighbor. If faith, hope, and charity sound familiar, it's probably because you've been to a wedding. This is the end of 1 Corinthians 13, which always seems to be read at weddings. And these are the virtues that elevate the natural morality to a supernatural level. These are the virtues, but he also explores vices. Vices are habits that lead away from God. A sin is a disordered act. And when we sin, it becomes easier to sin again. And vice can become just as habitual as virtue does. So when we do good things, they become easier to do and they become a habit. Once habitual, they are virtues. When we sin, sin becomes easier to do. And once they become habitual, they become vices. Follow? All right. The Summa Theologia is laid out in a question and answer format. So we reference parts of it by the specific question number. So if you want to work your way through the first part of the second part, this is what you get. The first 5 questions deal with human acts and their ends, including what beatitude is. Questions 6 to 21 deal with voluntariness, freedom, and the moral responsibility. Questions 22 to 48 deal with the passions and their moral relevance. Questions 49 to 89 give a detailed treatment of virtues and vices. Questions 55 to 67 focus on nature and classification of virtues. Questions 68 to 70 deal with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And then questions 71 to 89 deal with vices, sin, and law. That's the first part of the second part. The second part of the second part will focus on the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, as well as the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, but we will explore those in the next episode. So, if you want an example of how the rubber hits the road, Catholics talk about having 7 deadly sins, sins that break our relationship with God. They are the sins of pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. These are all vices, but each vice has a corresponding virtue that we are then to focus cultivating and practicing to the point where it becomes a habit so that the vice it recedes from our life and the virtue comes to prominence. So cultivating humility offsets pride. Cultivating generosity is the opposite of greed. Cultivating patience is the opposite of wrath. Cultivating kindness is the opposite of envy. Chastity is the opposite of lust. Temperance is the opposite of gluttony. And diligence is the opposite of sloth. See how that works? Both the virtues and vices here are not individual actions, but repeated actions that have become a habit. That's the key to virtue ethics. The journey of spiritual growth is to move from the vices to the virtues by consciously engaging in actions that become virtuous habits. Now, all those questions from the Summa, I can't go through them in any detail here because those questions cover a few thousand pages of the book. But trust me when I tell you, it's an absolutely brilliant work. The more you study it, the more it makes sense. In reading it, you come to have a profound understanding of human nature, of God, and how life and faith work. But reading the Summa is a project. Coming from a Protestant background, I had no formal training in philosophy, so I had to take 3 courses before I could even begin reading it. I tried to read it and I couldn't follow it. So I took 3 philosophy courses, and then I was able to read it. And once I started reading, It took almost a year to get through it all. But what a year. What a book. Many people think ethics comes from the outside, rules just arbitrarily imposed by God to govern our behavior. Ethics actually comes from the inside, to shape us into becoming more and more fully human as God designed humans to be. Catholic virtue ethics works by focusing on helping us understand and develop the habits and dispositions that bring us to holiness. This goes much deeper than mere rule following. It teaches us how to develop the virtues that lead us toward our ultimate end in life, which is union with God. So how do we get there? Well, in understanding virtue ethics, we need to know that reason, free will, and God's grace all play a role, and they need to work in harmony. We use reason to understand the moral good, and we use it to make conscious decisions that move us in the direction of developing better virtue. Free will is that capacity given to us by God that allows us to choose obedience or to go our own way. In episode 17, we talked about how most evil is the result of bad choices made by our free will. And then finally, there's God's grace. Without God's grace at work in our lives, we would have no way of being able to reach out to God. It's God that makes the choice to follow virtue even possible. So, to live a virtuous and holy life is something that God enables us to do. Our free will chooses to do, and our reason helps us in taking the right path to get there. The challenge in all of this is the free will. Reason is the intellect, the rational thought, capable of analyzing things logically. The will is very different. The will is where we have our desires, our passions, our wants. Reason can identify the path of virtue, but it's the will that follows us. And in a virtuous person, that will must be tamed and shaped to follow that reason. In a person that's not virtuous, the will tends to dominate. But for every one of us, there is that struggle. The Apostle Paul describes that struggle profoundly in Romans in chapter 7, starting in verse 15, where he says, quote, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but the sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not do is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I that do it, but the sin that dwells within me," end quote. And he goes on to talk about the need for Christ to get us to shape those desires to be in conformity with faith so that we can do what God calls us to. But that passage shows in such a humble way how much of a struggle we can have between what we want using reason and what we really want using our will. In fact, it's such a hard struggle. Modern philosophers ended up giving up the battle and now say that the will is stronger than reason. Blaise Pascal is famous for having said, quote, "The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of. We know the truth not only by reason, but by the heart," end quote. And I'm sure you're not surprised that most people today follow their will instead of their reason, and all sorts of hijinks and suffering ensue. So, if we want to follow the path of the saints and experience beatitude with God, how do we get there? We do it by a lifelong journey of cultivating the virtues. As I've been saying, for Aquinas, something is virtuous when it's a good habit. So a good habit is a good act. A good act is a good act. A good habit is a virtue. A bad act is a sin. A bad habit is a vice. Virtues are good acts that have been done so many times that they become a habit. Vices are sins that have been done so many times that they become habit as well. Now, left to our own, our will is certainly going to cultivate some virtues, but it will also cultivate vices depending on what we want. To build a virtuous life is to cultivate good acts in all aspects of our lives so they become habitual. And you know what? Human beings are very habitual creatures, whether we want to admit it or not. I had a period when I was in seminary where I was taking classes in seminary, but also teaching computer science at a local community college. And one of the hardest things when you teach a course is learning the names of all your students. And what I quickly found out was it wasn't so hard. My students I let them sit wherever they wanted, and they tended to sit in the same seats every class. And so I made a little seating chart for myself where they usually sat, and it helped me quickly learn their names. And I remember sitting in one of my seminary classes after having taught a computer science class thinking, boy, they have no idea. They have no idea they're behaving this habitually. And then I realized, wait, I'm sitting in the same seat I sit in this classroom every time. I'm no different. We are creatures of habit. So, cultivating a virtue begins with doing good acts to the point where they become habitual and no longer require the effort. A great analogy of this really is exercise. If we commit to start exercising in a meaningful way, it's very hard in the beginning because we want to do it the first few times, but then discover that it's hard and we start finding excuses not to exercise. And the struggle is to overcome that temptation not to continue. And most often that temptation wins. That's why 80% of New Year's resolutions are abandoned by February 1st. But if you stick with it, once exercise becomes a habit, we no longer struggle over it. And hopefully we reach the point when we want to do it even when it's hard to do so. Like when you're on a business trip, but you go to that little gym in the hotel to get the workout in anyway. There's a rule of thumb in our culture that it takes 66 days to form a habit. But that's a little too easy. There's so many variables that others argue that it can range anywhere from 18 to 254 days for something to become a habit. So, virtue ethics is a belief that by following reason to do good acts over time, those good acts become habits, and once they're habitual, they're easier to do. Thus, the will is tamed, and we live a more virtuous and holy life. We work on this specifically in several ways. One is through education and example, listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube. Our parents, our mentors, our friends all play very important parts in our moral development. In a capitalist society, emphasis is put on the individual as the basic unit of life, and each person's to make their own decision. Marxism, on the other hand, puts the state at the center, and we're supposed to trust the state to regulate society. For Catholicism, it's different. The family is the basic unit of the society. It's in the family that we are shaped and formed. We cannot do this on our own, and we cannot rely on the state to do it. The family is also called the domestic church because the family is where we learn so much of our faith. Relationships are that important. It's in the family we learn the spiritual disciplines, such as prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, which are so important to deepening of virtue. But in choosing our friends and mentors, we have to be very careful because the role they play is that important. Another part of the process is practice and repetition. We need to learn from our mistakes, build on our successes, and be mindful of the process. Socrates is famous for saying, quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," end quote. I learned that in high school and never forgot it. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's so true. We must learn how to reflect on how our lives are going. St. Ignatius of Loyola made a daily, what he calls examination of conscience, a central part of his spirituality. It's through reflection that we learn and grow. And then finally, we have our church. When we go to church, the purpose is to worship God. But we also go to receive the sacraments. We participate in our church to gain forgiveness of sins and be part of a community where we learn the Christian faith in all of its expansive beauty. This system of virtue ethics is different from other ethical systems. One popular system today is called utilitarianism, which bases the ethical value of an action based on its outcome. The best ethical choice is seen as the one that produces the most happiness. You can see why that would be popular in a consumerist culture. Another system developed by the philosopher Immanuel Kant is called deontology. It's focused on duty. He argued that every choice we make should be met with the highest possible standard for the world, that you should only do something if you think it is good enough, that a law should be passed for everyone to do the exact same thing. And so duty drives behavior. But, in a culture where we are good at rationalizing away any bad thing we want to do, that concept is fatally flawed. However, both of these systems are easier than virtue ethics. They can look at actions in isolation, whereas virtue ethics is looking at actions that have become habitual and have become part of who we are. And again, why do we do it? We do it because the goal of life, the teleology, is to become truly holy. People who are truly holy, when they die, go straight to heaven, and we acknowledge them as saints. The goal is to be a saint and to experience beatitude, to see the very face of God. That is today's lesson in a nutshell. Your head may be spinning, but remember that by following reason to do good acts over time, these good acts become habits, and once they're habitual, they're easier to do. Thus, the will is tamed, and we live a more virtuous life. It may seem strange that the key to develop good spiritual and ethical habits is what's required to develop a more mature and spiritual life, but it's not just a concept in the West, it's true in the East as well. Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, wrote this in the 6th century BC, quote, "Watch your thoughts, because your thoughts become your words, and your words become your actions, and your actions become your habits, and your habits become your character, and your character becomes your destiny," end quote. So he's wrestling with the same thing. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia books, and the great book, Mere Christianity, wrote in that book, quote, "Every time you make a choice, you're turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven, that is, it is the joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Each of us, at each moment, is progressing to the one state or the other," end quote. In the Gospel of John, Jesus said this in chapter 10. "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly," end quote. Virtue ethics is a very important part of that journey to the abundant life in Christ. We worship, pray, love, forgive, serve, sacrifice, and teach. We also engage in reflection, the examination of conscience, and the utilization of reflection. So, what will be on the test for today? Other than about the 2,500 pages of the Summa Theologia that I just walked us through. Well, you do things in life, and in repetition of them, you develop virtues or vices. You need to understand this and consciously work to develop good habits that become virtues. You also need to let God pour the theological virtues into your life and accept them. As we go through life, we reflect on how we are living and work to cultivate deeper virtue, because this leads to greater holiness. Our goal is holiness of life and to enjoy the beatific vision of God. And I have no doubt you're working to be a better person, and you have had ideas on how to tell the right from the wrong. But virtue ethics also shows why it is, how to grow, and what the destination is. And like everything else in Catholicism, it also shows that all roads lead to Rome.